Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to know who the hell stole January? Where'd it go? Where'd it go? Oh my gosh. Here we are, another testing season. Aren't we excited? Yeah, I see a little bit. Yeah, okay. How many of you are brand new and have never done a state test as far as being a test administrator, school coordinator? Okay, there's a couple. How many of you have done it for more than 10 years? Come on, Tammy, raise your hand. More than 20. Okay. You will survive this, I promise. It's a huge job. We're going to give you a ton of information today. We're going to be really going over some stuff very quickly. This is kind of here's where you find this information session. It's long, even doing it that way, but we've got a lot of information to cover. So if for those of you that are brand new at this, or maybe just done it 1 year, don't panic. There is a lot of information, but we are there for you, except for the next 3 days. Barrington and I are doing this, and then we're leaving town. We actually have a training for 3 days. We will be in Jacksonville. We will be available on computer, on email, but we will not be by the phone. So don't call and leave us a message unless you don't mind hearing back till Friday. So just to let you know, we are out of the office for the next 3 days, but after that, we're pretty much tied here until June. So, the fun begins. So without further ado, I want to introduce my boss. Dr. Frank Gilbert oversees the Test Development and Measurement Office, which includes the Performance Matters and Test Development Team, which created the PMAs, performance, what's PMA stand for? Progress monitoring activities. We have too many acronyms in our life. Anyway, and he also oversees Barrington and I, which is a job in and of itself. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Gilbert to get us started.
Good morning and welcome, or afternoon, and welcome to another exciting episode of testing in Orange County, Florida. The first thing I want to do is thank you all for your work and the diligence that you do with this complex and large task. And when you combine complex and large, the opportunities for error increase a lot. And the only way to avoid that is to stay organized and listen. And when you get to that point where you're not sure, be sure you check in with these folks, because using logic to deduce what the state has decided you should do is a dangerous proposition. Just because it seems like that's how it ought to be, it may or may not be. So please check in often, and they would much rather answer questions than solve problems. And so with that, we do it. This is one of those things that can seem thankless, and having spent my career in testing, I've always been the most popular guy in the district. But it's what gives us the information we need to do what needs to be done. It gives us the comparison, it gives us the next step for whatever it is the kids need to do. For that to be true, it all has to be consistent, and that's why there is a mind-numbing amount of details that all have to be the same in order for the data to mean something across the district. And that's where you guys come in. Is you could go to the grocery store and buy a bunch of questions in a test booklet, but it wouldn't be a standardized test, because it's the directions that make a standardized test a standardized test. So thank you for adhering to those. Thank you for your leadership in this, and know that it makes a difference, and we appreciate it. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Frank. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a yummy, yummy lunch. Make sure you stay awake. We have about 400 slides to cover. I know some of you probably are looking and seeing that there are 255 slides to go through. But I want to say that that's down from the 306 we did last year, so we're getting there. What we did is, with the training, we get PowerPoints from the state. Each are about, on average, about 200 slides. There are 4 tests, so multiply that by 2. That's how many we would have had to do if we went through each of those. What we try to do is to condense them as much as possible. However, make sure that you do read the manual, and we do mean that for real, for real. Read the manual, because everything that we cover, we are all responsible for. So without further ado, let's all get started. If you are trying to pull up the training on your computer, if you go to training.ocps.net, that will give you the PowerPoint that you can download for today's training. And then, of course, we will post it this afternoon to the IMS page for everyone to review. Just so that you know, we are covering the FSA PBT tests, the FSA CBT tests, which are the computer-based tests. We're going to talk about statewide science, because we know that some of you are from the middle schools. And then we will also talk about the NGSS, EOCs, and reading retake. Remember, we're just highlighting important things. Some things will be highlighted frequently because they're that important. Other things will tell you that you need to go back in the manual and read about it. Make sure that, as I said before, that you are indeed reading the test administration manuals, and that you, your test administrators, your proctors, are all adhering to the policies and procedures in the manuals. If you haven't met her by now, this is Cindy Landers. She's in charge of the East, Southeast, and STL learning communities, as well as alternative ed schools and high schools A through K. She's responsible for assisting with scheduling, possible invalidations, test administration questions that you may have, as well as things with TIDE and Pearson Access Next. I do exactly the same thing that Cindy does, and that's me. My hair is a little different, but that's me. I'm in charge of West, Southwest, and the North learning communities, as well as charter schools, and then all the other high schools, L through Z. If you ever need to get a hold of me, call Cindy's extension. But seriously, if you need to get a hold of me and you can't, call Cindy, and vice versa. If you need to get a hold of her and you can't get a hold of her, call me. We're both doing the same exact thing, so we can provide the assistance that you need. And this awesome, awesome person is Jeanette, who you met when you were getting signed in. She largely handles the ordering of additional test materials as well as accommodation materials, and she can create your accounts for TIDE and Pearson Access Next. Where to find some information? You guys do most of the testing, much more than the elementary schools, so you probably are well familiar with this site, but I'm just going to touch on a few things in case you are new and have never actually been there before. This is our IMS page. This is one of the main pages for our tests. It looks identically the same for all of the tests except for the information that pertains to that specific test. At the top left-hand corner of the page, you'll find what I call the quick access box. There you'll find the GPO accounts if you're at an OCPS site. You'll also find links to the testing portals. So that's FSA, NGSS, et cetera. And then this is where you'll order additional materials if you need them for your school. This is always where you'll order them. You won't order them from TIDE. You won't order them from Pearson Access Next. You'll always order them from our IMS page. All right, speaking of ordering materials, keep in mind that when you submit your order, we do get them, and when we have the materials, we get them to you. I promise Cindy and I don't have a stash that we have hiding because we don't want to give them out to you. Sometimes shipping takes a little longer than we anticipate, so as soon as we get them, either myself, Cindy, or Jeanette will fill your order, and then you'll get an email that it's ready. If you don't get an email, that's probably because it's not ready. But just kind of keep that in mind. We try to save you the time and effort of coming all the way here to pick up material, so we try to make sure everything is ready, and then we send an email letting you know you can come by. We do know that sometimes you may have meetings that you attend here at the ELC, so if you want to pop in just to check, maybe we just didn't quite get to email you right away, you can, but just know that it is very possible that it's just not ready yet. The next page, the next section, is the right-hand navigation pane, which you guys will hear us refer to very often. Here you can find the testing calendars that we use for testing test coordinators. Remember that these calendars are for your use. Of course, you can share the dates on the calendars, but you can't share the actual calendar itself. The reason being is because the state requires us to share the Uniform State Calendar, which is found on the OCPS homepage. Commonly accessed resources are also located here. That's where you can find your CFE outlines. You can find a link to EDW, information about paper-based accommodations, performance matters, and if you need to upload test security documents, you can also find that here. And then training information, which is largely going to be your test security training, both for OCPS employees and for those of you that are getting sub-proctors, as well as the training calendar and the new test coordinator training that we did at the beginning of the year. Now, in the middle of the page is where you'll find most of the useful information that you need. Our recordings and trainings for all the trainings that we do are always posted here under trainings and materials, which you guys are probably very familiar with. We are recording today's training, and we recorded the one from this morning. So once we get them from the production team, we will post them to the site. After today's training, which is at about 3 o'clock when I get back upstairs, I will post the PowerPoints so that you can have access to them as well. Testing resources are just that, resources to help you with testing. Sometimes we put templates for seating charts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then your parent letters. Normally we have them in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. So if you need to print out the letters, this is where you'll find them on the page. You must notify parents and students that there's testing. Another thing is when we're conducting trainings that are via Safari Live, the way that you can access the training if you missed the email is you can click on the banner. The banner will always be on the IMS page for that respective test. So if you click on the banner, it will take you straight to the session that we are starting. It will always have the date and the time that the session is starting. This is our training calendar, which you guys are probably well familiar with. Today, we are doing the spring administration training. Next week, we'll be doing TIDE, FSA, and Pearson Access. I can't believe we're doing that many trainings in 1 week, but we will get through it. And then, of course, you will have your CFE training down in March. All right. Now, some of you may be new to this, so you're like, okay, I've done the certification tool, I've done the infrastructure trial, but I still have no idea what I'm going to do in terms of actual testing. So where do you go from here? You might be feeling like this poor little baby there. So, of course, the first things that's most important is which tests are you having to administer? Of course, most of you are probably well-versed in knowing which tests which kids take. You want to pull rosters. Most of these tests are based off of the student's either grade level or course in which they are enrolled in. My favorite to get that accomplished is to pull the student roster from the student schedules in EDW, which is under Access Student. What that list does is it has a list of all the classes kids are enrolled in from periods 1 all the way through 7 or 6, how many you offer, and it has that for every kid. So if you need to find out which kids are taking geometry, you can go in, pull the report, and see which kids are enrolled in geometry, and then filter them out for your roster. You can also pull a student enrollment report from EDW. That will just show you all the kids who are enrolled at your school. And then you can always use baseball card to build a report. Make sure that when you are building your rosters that you take into consideration your kids that have IEPs. In most cases, they will be identified in the primary exceptionality column that has a letter. Usually it is, well, there are sporadic letters, but they're letters A through Z, basically. And then your LY kids would be under ELL. Those are the ones that need ELL accommodations. And then for the 504 plan kids, generally that does not show up on the report, so you'll want to double check with your staffing specialist or your 504 compliance person. You'll need to know when the kids are testing and where they will test. For most of you that are at digital schools, on the testing calendar, it breaks down for you the specific day that that test should be administered. If you're at a non-digital school, such as a middle school or a K-8, then of course you have a little bit more flexibility. But for those of you at the digital schools, your dates are already predetermined. Make sure that the location and test time is also added to your roster. It will make life easier for you in the end. And then if you're going to be making any changes to bell schedules, now is the time to kind of get that approved by your principal. Next, you want to make sure, as we mentioned before, that parents and students are aware of testing coming up, when they're going to test, and the days that they're assigned and the location. Consider using a mail merge, which you can pull directly from your rosters that you're going to be creating. And you can use that where the individual student's information can be added to the parent letters that are on the IMS page. Make sure you're also scheduling your practice test sessions for your students. That applies to kids in grades 3 all the way up through 12. The exception is if you have kids who have been doing the retakes, either they've taken the Algebra 1 retake or the FSA retake already this year, you don't have to worry about getting those kids into a practice session. Yes, ma'am?
It says on here, Barrington, one practice test session. So if I have a third grader that's taking the reading or a fourth grader doing the reading and math, they only have to do one, or they have to do the reading practice test and the math?
Generally speaking, because those tests are a little bit different, you'll want them to do the reading and the math. But if you do one of them, the actual format is fine, but we do recommend doing the reading and the math. All right, who will help you? Who will help you? Most times, because you're a testing coordinator, nobody's running up to your office, banging on the door saying, hey, let me test, let me test. So generally, you'll have to volunteer them to test, or you can ask them nicely. That works at some places, and for some schools, it doesn't. But as we always say, you get more bees with honey than vinegar. Let them know that you need them to assist with testing. Tell them not to plan any weddings or vacations or anything like that. But make sure that you do confirm with them their availability so that you don't schedule someone for testing on a day that they really won't be at school. Also, all test administrators and proctors need to complete the assessment security training course, which you guys are well familiar with. And then, of course, you'll need to provide a test administrator and proctor training at your sites. Now, of course, you're going to have that one person that's going to say, well, I did this last year, or I trained with you at the beginning of the year. Do I need to come and do this training again with you? The answer to that is yes. Just like how you have to sit through this training, they got to sit through their training. Now, of course, you're going to try not to make them have to go through 200 slides like we're forcing you to do, but make sure that they do have the information necessary. And we'll always post test administrator versions for you to use that you can add to at your schools. You're going to need to prepare materials for testing. This is just a list of some of the things you'll need for testing and the tests for which they are needed, but this is not the all-encompassing list, so there may be some things that you need to add as well. Of course, for example, you would not give a calculator to a kid taking the reading test because they won't need it. Also, we've heard rumors that some schools are using shopping bags and folders to put test materials in. That's probably not a good idea. Bags rip and folders fall and things go flying. Anybody play 50-card pickup? Actually, 52-card pickup. It's no fun. Generally, if possible, try to invest in testing bins or some kind of container that your test materials can be held in. You do need to keep track of your testing tickets. If you're providing calculators, you want to be able to have something that they can be contained in. So make sure that you're using some kind of bin or container as opposed to a bag or folder. Test group codes. Sometimes we get calls saying, where can I find the test group codes? Generally speaking, I don't know. But the test group codes are a 4-digit number that you yourself will create. It is going to be unique for each testing room that's going to be testing. The state uses this to identify which groups of students tested where and when. And you'll need to keep a record of the test group codes that were used. Generally speaking, the test group code should be placed on the seating chart as well as the security log. Here's a list of some things to consider to put in your testing bins. Generally speaking, as we mentioned before, you'll put in materials as they are needed. There are some staples that are always required, like your seating charts, your security log, test tickets, test booklets, that kind of thing. Due to test security, you are responsible for keeping track of all of your materials. If you give out 25 test tickets, you should be getting 25 test tickets back, all right? You want to make sure that you kind of instill with your test administrators that if a kid leaves the room, they need to know where that testing ticket is or that test booklet. So for example, let's say Johnny needs to go to the restroom. Before Johnny gets a restroom pass, you should know where Johnny's test booklet is or where his test ticket is before he leaves, all right? During testing. This is a picture of Where's Waldo. If you're around my age, you probably read these books when you were in elementary school, and you had to find Waldo in his red and white shirt. On testing day, you can't be Waldo. You need to be very visible. People need to know where to find you. You can't go hide out in your office. That I know is very tempting. I won't tell anyone. Or you're like, I'm done. I've done all I need to do for testing. Let them test. When they're done, I'll emerge. No, there's probably going to be some issue, something going on, so people will need to find you. So make sure they have a way of getting in contact with you, whether it be via radio or email, what have you. In the event that they can't reach you, you need to have a plan B. Who else would they contact if you're not available at that time? When you get your materials in, you want to make sure that you sort them. This is after testing is done. Sort them by type. Certain documents have to be returned, some have to be scanned, and some just get kept at your school. So if you sort them, you'll be able to keep track of what materials are where. Make sure that you do an initial count as you receive them. And then if you have any documents or materials that have to be returned to the vendor, make sure that you verify that count against your original shipping list at the end of the window. And then, of course, make sure you pack them according to the directions in the manual. For those of you, especially at the middle schools that will have to return the paper-based test, make sure that you are placing the correct label on the correct box. If it's to be scored, label it as such. Another thing we recommend is to not use Scotch tape. Many times when I get to the warehouse, I have boxes that have 12 strips of Scotch tape, and I guess people expect that to hold. Well, in a warehouse with no AC, there's a lot of humidity, and that basically becomes like paper. So what I recommend is using packing tape, duct tape. The same thing happens to masking tape, so avoid using masking tape as well. For your boxes, you want to make sure that they get to the vendor safe and sound. And with that, I'll turn things over to Cindy.
Okay, now we get to the fun stuff, security. Hey, and I know everybody hates this topic, but it can be very serious. We still have every year some folks making very bad decisions and consequently have lost their job and their career. We've had teachers make bad decisions. We just recently, a teacher was using a test booklet in the classroom with her kids. And that teacher's going to lose her job and her career. It just is not worth it. Please, please talk to your teachers about this. It does get out. I mean, all the different times that things have happened, and, you know, if it's a teacher giving a little bit too much help in the classroom during the test, and the kids go home and they talk to their parents, and their parents call me. We had a teacher that had made a copy of a test one year. The next year, she went to print it out so she could use it with her classroom. And when she sent it to the printer, which happened to be in the front office, which wasn't a real great move, the printer ran out of paper and she didn't realize it. Well, the next morning, the secretary comes in, pops the paper in, and out comes the rest of the test. And I get a phone call. You know, these teachers are no longer in the system and they no longer have a career in education. So please talk to them about it. You know, they think that it's easy and there's no way it's going to get caught. It does. They look at erasure marks and the quantity of erasures that kids have. And statistically, there's a certain number and it gets way above that and it gets flagged and we get some information about it and we investigate. I just want teachers to understand it's not worth their job. It's not worth it. So please talk to them about this. We're going to go through this pretty quickly. Again, it's in all of the manuals, every one of them. You've got the CBT and PBT manuals. You will be getting the NGSSS and science manuals probably next week. So let's go through. There's the security statute. It's in the back of the book. Again, it's threatening the integrity of the test or what they really care about. And again, it doesn't have to be, it pretty much has to be intentional to get to the point of losing your job over. But you do need to be careful with things that are the big rules. We did have professional practices because practices investigate. One of our test administrators, she did not lose her job, but she did have some sanctions because of a pretty grave error during testing. It was not intentional, but it was pretty significant, and they invalidated quite a few kids over it. And so she did have some sanctions drafted from her. So it is very important that you pay attention to these rules and regulations. Again, this is common sense, reading or viewing of the passages or test items, revealing them, copying them, explaining or reading the passages to the students, all those kinds of things that we know we are not supposed to be doing. It is important that you do go over this with your folks, because if somebody were to get investigated because of an issue, a teacher, and you did not cover this in your training with them, it would be on your head if there's a problem. Okay, so you want to make sure you cover this. That's why, as Bear said, we start with the state trainings, because I want to make sure you see this, that you've got this. And then you do the same thing with your teachers, and that way if somebody does something wrong, it's on them, not on you. Okay, again, everybody must be familiar with the statute and the rule. And again, that's in here. I want to make sure you understand, this is not a secure document. When you go to give these out, you can give these out to your teachers now. This is not something that they need to have the day before you have your training. The only reason we don't want these out in teachers' hands or in the school from the previous year is because rules change. We don't want teachers pulling this out of a file cabinet and say, oh, I've got the manual from last year, I'll use that. There are differences. There are differences, and it's very important that you use this year's. But other than that, this is not secure. Get it in your teacher's hands. They're responsible for going through this and reading the pertinent parts to them. Okay, they also have to pass the security course that's out on PDS. Again, you need to make sure all materials are in locked storage when you have them. You need to track any paper materials. Most of you all are secondary, but you might be getting large print, Braille, any of those. They still need to be tracked. They still need to have a chain of custody form. You need to fill those out for even one booklet. This is more important for the middle schools, but right now the rule states that no more than 3 people can have access to the locked storage room. You say, well, that's not a big deal. All I get is the writing, grade 6 and 7. And obviously high schools can put it in a locked storage, a locked file cabinet, no problem. Next year, you will probably be having a lot more paper. Right now, the state is voting on a rule that says all grades 3 through 8 will be paper next year. So this does become an issue for that. So you need to start thinking about that for next year, if you're going to be there for next year. We will be talking to principals and to other folks about getting ready for that. So just be thinking about that, but you do have the paper this year you need to deal with, and if it won't fit in a cabinet, you need to make arrangements for it. Again, no monitoring software. I think it's called Land School, where you can go in and see what's on a kid's computer in the labs. You cannot use that. Test administrators cannot administer to their family. You need to really pay attention to that, especially when it comes to the volunteers that you may have working as proctors and making sure, since you don't know them as well, making sure they're not in a room with a family member. Admission of students, especially those of you in high school, and especially the ones where you are doing things like the FSA reading retakes, where you've got kids that are no longer in school. Thank you. That are no longer in school. You need to check for IDs. If you don't know them, you need to ensure that you can verify to the best of your ability who those kids are. Again, with proctors, you want to make sure that you're not testing in a situation so large that you can't control it. Those of you that have been around for a while know that we used to test quite a bit in auditoriums and stuff. That was never a good situation. I can't tell you how many times I would get phone calls from parents where their kids would come back and say, oh my God, I couldn't hear anything. There was always noise. There was always, rustling. Even with this, when you guys are being very attentive and pretty quiet, there's still kind of background noise when you get this many people together with the coughing and the rustling, especially from me. But the rustling of papers, and especially with kids, there's always just a little bit, and it becomes very hard to control. So please do not use those big rooms if at all possible. If you need to use them, call Bear or I first. so that we can make sure that you've got the resources that you need and that there's nothing we can do to avoid it, to use those. Yes, ma'am. You got to speak up.
What would be an ideal student-to-teacher ratio for the test?
We have that, it's right here. 1 to 25, you just need one test administrator, and this isn't ideal, this is rule. Anything more than 25, you have to have an additional proctor in there, and for each 25 kids after that. So even though it says, 51 to 75, if you've got a room that you're putting 51 or up to 75 kids, call us first. Because we need to see if we can pare that down by getting you some more resources. That's just not a good situation, and I guarantee you, you will have issues in there. It's going to be a problem for the most part. Again, school personnel and non-school personnel can be trained as proctors. Only school personnel, that means a school board employee, can be a test administrator. Anybody, school personnel or non-school personnel, can be a proctor. So that means that subs, Kelly subs, the interns, they cannot be test administrators. They must be a school board employee. Now, this means that paras could be test administrators. You could even have a school secretary if they've been trained, if they have the facilities, the faculties to do this. Now, you as a test coordinator can make the decision, should this person be a test administrator? Be responsible for that room. And there are some teachers that I wouldn't necessarily want to put in the room as a test administrator. You have the authority to say, I really would rather have that person be a proctor. Okay? So you cannot put retired teachers, retired principals, even if they still hold their certificate, if they're going through Kelly, or they're just a volunteer, they cannot be a test administrator. As capable as they are, as much as you'd like to have them in that room, they can only be a proctor, all the way in the back. You got to really speak up.
For the substitutes we're getting, is it going to be the same as last year, that they cannot be alone, or
Can you hear her?
for the substitutes? Did you hear?
So she's asking about the sub-proctors.
Oh, the sub-proctors?
Can they be left alone?
No, the sub-proctors cannot be left alone with the classroom. They cannot be a test administrator. The classroom always has to have a test administrator. That means that you probably need to have at least one test administrator type person who's been trained, been through your training, and is a school employee to go be the person to give breaks for bathrooms and that kind of thing. You cannot leave a proctor alone if they are not an employee. Now, if you had an extra person who was a proctor in there, but they were a school board employee and they were trained as a test administrator, but you just put them because you had them as the second person in that room, then that person could act as a test administrator and they could break themselves. Okay? But that's the only case. Yes, ma'am.
We have a senior intern, so I understand that they can't be a test administrator, but can they be a proctor?
Yes, they can be a proctor.
But from what I'm looking at your slide, they cannot touch the testing material.
Well, they can't be responsible for the testing materials. I mean, if they're going to pass things up and help the teacher pass things out, that's fine. But they can't be, when they're talking about distributing and collecting, they're talking about you wouldn't want to give the materials to her and have her go up by herself and walk them to the front office, because that's making her responsible. But if you're having her help put them on the tables for the kids, that's fine. She can't be left alone with the materials or responsible for the materials. Okay? Okie doke. And again, volunteers, just make sure that they have to have gone through all of the stuff that we make all our volunteers go to make them, that they're acceptable to stay on our campus. They have to go through that process first. So, again, proctors can help monitor rooms. They can also help when it comes to you doing your job. So some of those, if you're getting some of the sub-proctors, and we're still getting the final word on how much we're going to get from that and how many, I hope you all filled out the survey that was sent out to principals, or somebody did, for your schools as to how many subs you would, or whether you were going to use them or not. But basically, they could even help you with what you do. They could help, getting the material sorted, putting labels on, as long as you're there with them. As long as they're not responsible for the materials, somebody's got to be there with them. But they could also help you out with that, sharpening pencils, anything else that you have them do. Okay, security numbers. You do need to keep track of those booklets, even if you only have one or two. You still have to keep all the paperwork on tracking them. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Cindy, if you did not receive an email, that means you're not getting a proctor, sub-proctor, or your principal.
How is that working?
All right, so the way that worked is the survey was only sent to principals. If your principal responded, then you will likely get them. If he or she responded that yes, they want to get proctors. If they didn't respond or contact Dr. McKelvey by Friday, then they probably will not be getting subs.
By this Friday.
No, this past Friday. Yeah, because they got the survey a week ago, more than a week ago. So
What was the survey title, so I can remind my principal?
it was titled the Sub-Proctor Sub-Survey.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so again, you must track those numbers. Those of you in middle school also have the writing that you must keep track of that. They must have a signature every time they change hands. And you also must have them assigned to a specific student. Again, if you get additional materials, you need to keep track of those as well. So you would want to add them to those lists of materials that you get, and make sure those get added, and that when you get things back and you are trying to justify your numbers or verify your numbers that you've got the right amount, make sure you've added in any additional materials that you do get. And just while we're speaking about additional materials, if you have any WIDA materials, at the end of this, you may go upstairs and there will be some folks standing by to check out your WIDA materials if you'd already gotten an email from Jeanette that your materials were ready, just so you know. But be patient, because we had a line at the end of the training this morning for elementary schools. So a lot of you are going to be going up to get materials. So just be patient. Test irregularities. This is something that you need to take seriously, especially if it's happening during the big testing. We need to know what's going on. The biggest part of this is communication. If you have one kid that you caught with a cell phone, I don't need to know about that unless mom or dad is getting really hot about it, and you want to make sure that I know about it because they said they're going to call downtown. And that way I'll just say, look, they got caught with the cell phone. But if you have a fire drill, you have a big incident in one of the rooms, you have an incident where the timing was not correct in a room, I need to know about those immediately. You need to give me a phone call or an email. And then you also need to fill out a testing irregularity. What's going to happen is when I get those, I make the decision, okay, this could affect whether you can get those kids back in testing or not, and I'll call the state and let them know. The thing is, if you call me and say, I had a fire alarm go off, well, it turns out there was a small fire in a science lab. and it took almost 3 hours for the kids to get back in their rooms. I'm going to call the state and say, when you first let me know about that, we got a problem, they're out, I'll let you know when they get back in. And if it's the end of the day, I'm going to say, don't worry about it. I'll call the state and say, those kids were never able to get in to finish. They'll be able to go in the next day. If you don't let me know and you call me at the end of the day and say, Cindy, we've been out for 3 or 4 hours, these kids were never able to finish the test, I'm going to call the state and they say, why didn't we know about this 3 or 4 hours ago? And you might not be able to get those kids back in. Communication is critical when it comes to anything with test irregularity. Bear and I are always by the phones, except when we aren't. No, we're always there, especially during testing. I guarantee you, we eat by the phones, we drink by the phone sometimes, water only. But we're there. So communication, always call me. If you have something happen, as soon as everybody's safe, you need to be on the phone and let me know what's going on. Security breaches. If you think that anything has happened, you need to let me know immediately. It's very important that we be kept abreast, because if it turns out that, you know, something happens and you knew about it, and then we find about it through another method, and trust me, we very often find out about things, you don't want to be caught having not reported it. It's also important for us to know so that we can maintain the integrity of our test. We've had fewer problems in a lot of districts. We've never had a major, like, cheating scandal where there's been collusion or something like that, and we want to maintain that. There's a lot of integrity in Orange County as far as this goes. I'd put you guys up against anybody in the state as far as the quality in which you run your program, and we want to keep it that way. We don't need anybody looking over our shoulder for that, because one, it's not necessary, but we want to maintain that integrity here. So always let me know if something happens, maintain that communication. Invalidation. For the most part, this is kind of up to you guys, unless it's something big having to do with timing or multiple kids. But if you have a student that gets caught with a cell phone, as far as I'm concerned, just invalidate it, it's up to you. If you do have a single kid cheating, the teacher saw him, Johnny, leaning over to Bobby Sue's paper and looking on, that's an immediate invalidation. I'm not there. Very often I've had teachers or you guys call me and say, this is what the teacher saw, should I invalidate? Well, I'm not there. I'm not there in the room. It's the teachers and your call. So if the teacher says Johnny was cheating, then it's her call. It's an immediate invalidation, and you pull him out of the classroom. It's the same thing as what would happen in the classroom. If she saw that in the regular classroom, what would happen? She'd immediately pull him, send him to the dean's office, and, you know, invalidate his whatever they were working on. Same thing for the test. I'm not there, but if you let me know, I will back that up to the top of the mountain, okay? It's your call, and I will say, the school made the call, it's an invalidation, it's a good call, the invalidation stands. I'll never override that. But when it's that kind of thing, plus, please let your teachers know they need to do that immediately. They do not need to be letting the student finish the test, which has happened. They let the student finish the test, and then the teacher came to the test coordinator at the end of the day and said, I think maybe Johnny was cheating. And what happened? You know, basically she just kind of observed it and that was it. Well, that's really hard to invalidate later. If she thinks something was happening, she should wait and observe it again. Remind the student, you need to keep your eyes on the paper. If it happens again, boom, he's out of there. You can't let him finish the test and just say, well, we'll do it after the fact. I know teachers don't like invalidating because in some cases, this is real high stakes for the kids. But the bottom line is we need to handle it correctly. The teachers do. So please let them know it needs to happen immediately. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about paper-based testing. I know a lot of you aren't doing a huge amount of it at the high schools, but the middle schools, you're doing grades 6 and 7. And the high schools, you do have a few paper-based. Oh, is this yours? Yep. Oh, never mind. I'm going to turn it over to him.
All right, let's rip and ride through paper-based testing. Stuff about third grade testing I'm going to skip past because none of you have to worry about that. So of course, just make sure that you are adhering to the policies and that you give students the correct amount of time for testing. The correct amount of time is 120 minutes, which you'll see in the next slide. The sessions are 120-minute session that applies to grades 4 through 7, as well as for grades 8 through 10. Make sure that for the paper-based versions of the test that you are using the pre-ID labels. There is no information to be bubbled on the front of the test booklets, so make sure that you are putting labels on them. The nice thing about TIDE is that you can print labels on demand, and next week in the training, we will talk about that. For students that are receiving Braille and large print, most of those we're well aware of because we've gotten lists from the vision department. For those that had to request them through the paper-based accommodations process, we're hoping to get that from the ESC department sometime next week. So as we get that from the ESC department, we will start informing you of which kids are receiving paper-based accommodations. Of course, there is practice tests available for the FSA writing. Those practice tests are accessible, of course, via the secure portal, as well as, secure browser, as well as the FSA portal. Of course, if you have students who are taking the paper-based version of the test, but they have an accommodation such as flexible presentation, where they need, flexible responding, where they need to type the written response, then there are directions in the back of the pink manual that will guide you through that process. Essentially, kids will type the response in Notepad, you will print it out, you will tape it inside the test booklet, you will delete it from the computer, and submit the test booklet. You cannot give kids extra paper to write their response. What they've been provided is all that they get. There is a stand and stretch break, which we'll talk about in just a second. It's only 3 minutes. Don't give them 2 minutes. Don't give them 5 minutes. They only get 3 minutes during that time for the break. Calibration schools. By now, you should already know who you are. If you don't know what a calibration school is and you're not sure if you're one of them, email Cindy or myself, and we'll get you the proper information that you need. Keep in mind that for calibration schools, your return labels for your paper-based materials will have the stripe across them. If you're calibration for writing, you'll also be calibration for reading. And then, of course, the nice thing about writing, where everybody's testing on the same day, if you're calibration, you return everything together at the appropriate time. As I mentioned before, the stand and stretch break is 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Accommodated materials for the FSA writing for grades 4 through 7 comes in the form of large print, contracted Braille, uncontracted Braille, and 1 item per page. And of course, you guys are aware of how to request those. The regular materials for grades 4 through 7, as we mentioned before, will be paper-based. We've talked about the on-demand labels and that you have to print them. You will get them usually about 2 weeks before the start of the window. However, keep in mind that you cannot put the labels on the booklets more than a week prior to the testing date. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind. You have 1 week to put the labels on the test booklets. Make sure that if the barcode is smudged, that you print a new label. Make sure that you are putting the labels in the correct space. We've been talking about this all day long. I will remind you several times today. Every time you have a label, the label goes in the box on the booklet that says apply label here. Don't put it over anything else. Don't put it over the barcodes, anything like that. Somebody's going to call and say they did it. We know it happens. However, just follow the directions. Most times it's people who volunteer to help you. They tend to create more of a mess than they are helping. If you're like me, we just have to do stuff by yourself anyways. Just put the labels on yourself. At least that way you'll know that they've been put in the right place. If you put the label over the barcode and ship it to the vendor, guess what? None of your kids are going to have scores, and you're going to get them back in late reporting, which sometimes is August, September, October. It's no fun. So put the labels in the right spot. You can't have your kids come help you at night and put labels on the test booklets, so please don't do that. If you like to have AC and be able to put, good gas in your car, the stuff you want to do is follow the directions. If you don't have a job, you can't have AC at home unless you do some other things which we won't talk about. For paper-based materials, make sure that you are completing the chain of custody form, especially if you have accommodation materials and it's just one test or two tests here and there. Make sure you're completing the chain of custody form. That way we can track who has custody of the materials at all times. If you find that the information is incorrect on the label, do not use the label. Shred it, print a new label, and put the correct label on the booklet. Keep in mind that you can only put the FLE ID into TIDE as well as Pearson Access Next. So if you're wondering why it won't let you add that new student, it's probably because you're adding the 4080 number or their social. Only use the FLE ID. Also note that if a book does not have an FLE ID, if the book does not have a label on it, they will not process it. Then I'll get an email from DRC, and then I'm going to call you and ask you why wasn't there a label, and then I will tell DRC that I will send them a label so that they can identify the student. In red, you see it up there? Apply pre-ID label there. You guys think I'm playing, but I'm very serious about that. Make sure that the labels go in the right spot. If you put a label on a booklet, I know logically it's like, oh, well, it doesn't belong there, let me take it off. That actually creates more of an issue than not. Just leave the label there, put another label over that label, you should be good to go. All right, now let's talk about the computer-based test. The stuff that I've already talked about, I will kind of skip through, but we are going to be covering the grades 8 through 10 writing. Now we're going to be talking about 4 through 10 reading, grade 3 through 8 math, and the end of course exams, which is Algebra 1 and Geometry. All right. As I mentioned before, you are responsible for the information in the manual. By now, all of you should have received the manual at your school. If you haven't, ask the person at the front desk where they are. If you need to order additional materials, the form will become available tonight after I have gone to bed. Then that way you can order as much as your heart's content. And then Jeanette will try to fill those orders as soon as she can. I showed you the manual. It matches my shirt, kind of, sort of. It probably maybe Cindy's shirt more than it does mine. Remember to adhere to the calendar for assessments, which is going to be on our IMS page. And then, of course, for kids who are receiving paper-based accommodations, in the past, we would always say that you needed to test those kids at the very beginning of the window. If you're at a high school and you're digital, everybody tests on the same day, so that's not a problem. Where it sometimes is a problem is for those of you at the middle schools where your windows are a little bit broader. If you don't return them during the first week of testing, then what tends to happen is you may receive your scores during late reporting, which is not a bad thing, just you may not receive them with everyone else's scores. For the computer-based writing, the test is still 120 minutes. For FSA ELA writing retake, the kids have up to half a day to complete that test. So just kind of keep that in mind, the difference for the retake. While we are talking about retakes, as we were going through your certification tools, many of you at the middle schools seem to think that you do retakes as well. You don't do any ELA retakes. That's only for high school, all right? The only retakes that the middle schools do are the Algebra 1 retake. Yes, sir.
This is the first year I've had a student with vision impairment. How does it work with ELA rights when you become doing an essay?
I'm not sure what you mean, but just email me and I can take care of that with you. All right, for the reading, 6 through 8, 85 minutes, 2 sessions. 9 through 10, 90 minutes, 2 sessions. These 2 sessions are always over 2 days. Kids cannot take session 1 and session 2 for ELA reading on the same day. For math, 6 through 8, it's 60 minutes, but there are 3 sessions. The 3 sessions are done over 2 days. Session 1 generally is done on 1 day because students can't use calculators for that. And then session 2 and 3 are usually done on the next day. For Algebra 1 and retakes, it's 90 minutes, 2 sessions over 2 days. And of course, the same thing applies to geometry. Now, of course, if the kids aren't finished, they can continue, but they can't continue for more than half of the school day. All right, a few things that are new. By now, all of you should have the new secure browsers installed on your computers. If you didn't, you would have discovered that during the infrastructure trial because you would have had some issues. Of course, that we've been talking to death about is the FLE ID is used for all testing. We're no longer using the Social Security or student ID number. The FCAT retake as well as the ELA retake are during the same window. Of course, FCAT reading retakes right now is only for our adult students that are coming back to test. And then the FSA Algebra 1 retake is also during that same time. Remember, kids who take the Algebra 1 retake cannot take the first time test in April as well. It's one or the other. Another thing is there's no more the requirement of the comment form. In fact, it's not even available anymore. So that's one less thing to worry about at the end of testing. Also, the accommodations guide has been posted to the FSA portal. So you can download a copy of that so that you're more aware of the accommodations that can be provided for each test. For technical issues, the first thing you want to do is have your TSR notified so that he or she can try to resolve the issue. If it's something that they can't resolve, we recommend that they also reach out to their district IT admin for some insight. And if that doesn't work, then contact FSA at the help desk or let Cindy and I know as well if you're having any big issues as opposed to individual type stuff. Handheld calculators. This one comes up quite a bit. Handheld calculators are only available for math, grades 7 and 8, as well as the EOC tests. 6th grade does not get to use calculators for the test, so just kind of keep that in mind. Giving a kid a calculator for a session that they shouldn't have or giving them the wrong type of calculator is grounds for invalidation. Make sure you provide the rightful accommodations according to the test. And then, of course, for kids who are in grades 6 through 8, where they have the 3 math sessions, if because of their extended time accommodations, if it has to extend to 3 days, that is fine. But generally, the plan is for them to take it in 2 days. And then if they can't finish, or let's say it's 1 o'clock, school's getting out in 2 hours, and they're not going to have time to start session 3, wait till the next day to have them do session 3. Yes, ma'am.
Can we have only the online calculator, or do we have to do it?
You can just use the online calculator, yes. In fact, we recommend it because the nice thing with the online calculator is it's only available when it's allowed, and it's always going to be the correct calculator. CBT accommodations, just make sure that you have them assigned before testing, and Cindy will talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. Headphones. Headphones or earbuds are needed for the reading portion of the test. If the kids are taking it on the computer, they need to have headphones for grades 4 through 10. Make sure that they use the sound check at the beginning of the test. If you're not going to be providing headphones for kids, you want to make sure that they know to bring them, but you will need to have some extras just in case they forget to bring them or the ones that they brought are not compatible or don't work. Closed captioning is still available for our hearing impaired students, so make sure that you know which kids are eligible and that you turn that accommodation on and tied.
Hey, Barry.
Yes, ma'am.
Will the district provide any more headphones, or will we need to speak with our principals? The reason I ask this is I believe that Apple headphones are not compatible with our laptops, so we ran into a big issue with that last year.
Okay. As far as the district providing them, I'm not aware of that. Double check with your principal and or TSR, and then also send me an email so that I can follow up with our district IT guys as well. But I'm pretty sure the answer to that is no. Do I see a hand over here? No? Okay. Reopen tests and reopen test sessions. That can be a little bit confusing. We will talk about them in greater detail at next week's TIDE training, so just be aware of that. Just know that if you are submitting either of those, you need to let Cindy or myself know. Generally speaking, we don't get an email notification that you submitted one, so unless you contact us because of all the other things going on, we generally don't sit and check that they need to be approved. Also, if we don't have any insight as to what's going on, we're not going to approve it. A lot of times I'll say, hey, Cindy, did you talk to Jessica about her reopen tests? If Cindy says no, then I'm not going to approve them, but I probably will call you if I happen to see them and ask you about them. So just make sure that you let us know so that we can get them approved for you quickly so the kids can get back to testing. Testing irregularities, of course, you'll fill out the form and let us know so that we can pass that on to the school district. To the state, sorry. Many of these you're probably familiar with, but I'll just touch on them real quick, at least the important ones. The FSA portal is where you will find all the information you need that pertains to FSA testing. The FSA reporting system is where you will go to retrieve student scores once we get them back. Normally, we start getting scores back towards the end of May as well as in June. The session ID is separate and different from the test group code. It is essentially the password for FSA testing to get into the test. Student interface, test administrator interface, work in conjunction to become the test delivery system, and that is what the kids use to test and how the test administrators get kids through creating the sessions. Tide, you guys are well aware of. It's the laundry detergent that you buy to wash your clothes in, as well as what you use to organize your testing. I think Tide is better than Gain, but that's my personal opinion. Test tickets. Test tickets, of course, will always be needed for computer-based testing. Kids to be tested, we've talked about this in great detail. For example, kids need at least high school kids, have to pass the reading retake or the grade 10 test in order to graduate, as well as the Algebra 1 retake, all right? If a kid takes one grade level of the reading test, they must take that same grade level of the writing test, and vice versa. A lot of times we have schools that will test kids on, say, ELA writing 6th grade, and then for whatever reason, test them on reading 7th grade. The scores will not match. You will not get a score for that student. Same thing for kids who are in 9th grade. Make sure that they're taking the appropriate test for their cohort. Yes, ma'am. Can you say that one more time for me? Okay, yes, if they've already passed the PERT and they're not currently in Algebra 1, they're not taking the course, you're correct. They do not need to take the retake again. So if they have a score of 97, they're not currently sitting in an Algebra 1 course, then the concordance score will work for that requirement. If they are in Algebra 1, they have to take the EOC for the 30% of their grade. And of course, I just talked about that, so that was a good question. You saved me a little bit. Yes, ma'am?
What about kids that are retaking Algebra 1?
If the kids are retaking Algebra 1, they're probably retaking it because they didn't pass the course.
No, I have kids that pass the course and pass the test, and now they're retaking Algebra 1.
Right, so they didn't pass the course, so they have, because they're in the course again, they have to take the EOC again to get the 30% of their grade. Yes, ma'am?
Do they have to take the Algebra 1 or can they sit for the first for the concordance?
Which ones?
If new students who have never sat for.
So if a kid, so let's say this is a kid that came from, huh? New Hampshire, okay. Kid from New Hampshire, they already have the Algebra 1 credit. They can they can take the PERT or sit for the Algebra 1 EOC. All right, I'm gonna take one more question and then move on.
If I have a student who is taking 7th grade math and taking 8th grade math, do they take both of them?
No, they would just take one. Generally, it would be the higher level math. So if he's taking 8th grade and 7th, then he'd probably just take the 8th grade test. And the reason why is because more than likely, he's probably gonna be taking Algebra 1 next year. Yes, Carol?
Do our Hurricane Maria students, the 11th and 12th graders, need to take the Algebra 1 retakes?
If they're working towards a diploma, yes.
I thought they didn't need it. I thought it was a requirement for Hurricane Maria students.
As far as I know, if they're going to be graduating with the diploma in the state of Florida, they will have to take it. We can look into that, but as far as I know, they will have to take it. All right, let's talk about students confined to custodial residential institutions. We've actually already talked about that this morning with the person to which this applies. But if that applies to you as well, then the kids need to test. Kids who are in special programs such as FLVS, McKay scholarships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they are also, bless you, they're also able to take the tests with you at your site. Generally, the parents will contact you in advance to get those kids registered for testing. And we will also, for the virtual school kids, let you know who those kids are. Homeschool parents will also contact you about having their child test. You will accommodate them as well. We will be able to provide you with their FLE ID as needed. Same thing for McKay scholarship programs. Some of you may have already been contacted by them. They will be able to test at your site. And again, we'll make sure that you can get the FLE ID information that you need for them. Some of you may also be contacted by private schools, and that's largely because the private schools kids are currently 8th graders and plan to attend an OCPS high school next year. They're also eligible to test. There is a process that we do to get them FLE IDs, so if you've been contacted by them, let us know. Generally speaking, the only ones that we tend to hear from is students that are at the Christ School that are going to Boone, and generally we handle that in advance. So, Christina, you already know how we do that. Oh, there you are. And I haven't heard from them yet, but if I do, I'll let you know. All right. Make sure that your ELL kids get their proper accommodations. And then, of course, we know that kids are to, their ELL are not exempt. That is an OCPS policy. So they still take the reading and the writing ELA portions of the test. They also have to take the EOCs. Kids with disabilities, we talked about giving them their accommodations and making sure that those accommodations are appropriate by test. And when I say that, I'm talking largely about kids who get, for example, oral presentation for test items and so forth like that. They wouldn't be able to get that accommodation for the reading passages on the test. Accommodations are generally in Appendix A of the manual, so make sure that you are referring to that. Also, as we mentioned before, the accommodations that need to be turned on prior to testing for these kids are listed here. We also have the reading and writing passage booklets available for those kids that need that accommodation. We've talked about paper-based accommodations and that process quite a bit already. Make sure that your test administrators are given the appropriate scripts for those special accommodations such as Braille and large print. And then, of course, for makeup testing, make sure that you guys are adhering to all of the same test security procedures and policies that you do for the main testing sessions as well as the makeup sessions. Classroom materials can never be left in the classrooms overnight. You have to collect them each day for testing. Right. And as we mentioned before, if a kid is absent for session 1, the next day they return, they start with session 1. The next day after that, they'll do session 2. The system will not permit them to do session 1 and session 2 on the same day. All right. Cindy.
Okay, we're going to go over test materials now, because you do have test materials, even though you're doing CBT testing at this point. You've got the planning sheets, the reading, writing passage booklets, worksheets, and work folders. If you have these left over from last year, you can still use them if they have been unused. And when we say unused, I mean they're still shrink wrapped. If you've opened packages and you were giving them out last year, those should be gone ahead and shredded. But you can use any that are still shrink wrapped. You must use the actual documents. You can't use just blank pieces of paper. That's part of the standardization. Again, Frank was talking about that. It has to be given in exactly the same way. So if you are going to use them and you need additionals, you can copy it out of the manual, these pull out, and you can make copies of this. But if you're going to use a planning sheet, this needs to be the planning sheet you're using. You can't just hand them a blank piece of paper or a piece of paper written on, pulled out of a yellow legal pad, whatever. It needs to be the actual sheets. Now, whether it's yellow or not, that I don't care about. I think the planning sheets are yellow for writing, but, make sure that you do copy this out. We've got lots of additional copies. Part of this whole process is the more you plan ahead of time, the more successful you're going to be. So start looking at those planning sheets, that stuff that, you need to have, but you don't want to be running down to the county office the day before testing because I don't have enough planning sheets or I didn't get enough. That's not something you want to have to do. You want to start getting that stuff as soon as those order forms open up so that you get them into your office, you get them. If you want to start counting them out, that's fine, but make sure you've got them available. Yes, ma'am.
Just a point of clarification, I believe that I have received my order for the retakes, but not my order for the upcoming grade 9 and 10. Have those been shipped?
Actually, she should have gotten
Should have
that.
gotten everything.
You should have gotten everything. Yeah, both are in for the FSA and the retakes. What's not in is the NGSS portion of EOCs and science. Those will be in next week.
No, those are going out this week.
Oh, those are going out this week? Okay, we have those and they'll be going out this week. Okay? So, but the bottom line is, don't hold off and think you've got lots of time. You're going to be shocked at how fast this comes up, and all of a sudden, I have no time. I have, all of your spare time is gone, and you're going to be working some extra hours on this, I guarantee it, and it's better to get as much done ahead of time as you can. Again, the planning sheets, again, make sure they're distributed. Used planning sheets are considered secure materials. You'll be hanging on to those until you get the actual results back, and then they can be destroyed. But hang on to any extras you have left over from this year. Put them in a shelf. Make a note that you've got extras of these. As long as they're shrink wrapped, you can use them again for next year. Because again, you're going to have to be running down here probably for test booklets, for other stuff. You don't want to have to be doing that for something like a planning sheet. Reading and writing passage booklets, that's part of an accommodation, the paper-based accommodations, which you need to fill out the form that's out on our website in order for ESE to approve this. But make sure you get that done fairly quickly because those take some time to get ordered and in. Again, they contain the writing passages for kids that can't read well on the computer, but it lets them read the writing passages on paper, and then they actually answer on computer. So that is one of those. You can go ahead and request it, but it needs to go through the actual process where ESE approves it or not. Okay, again, those passage books are secure materials. Make sure you get those sent in with your not to be scored materials, because those the state will question if they don't come back. Worksheets, same way. Just make sure you've got enough in and get those done. Work folders are 4 pages for that. Those are for the math test. Math to NEOC test sessions, with the exception of 6 through 8 math for sessions 2 and 3, and 6 through 8 math session 2. So just be aware those are available now. You can go ahead and when the order form goes in, you said the end of today, right? Yeah. That the order forms for all of these things will be going up the end of today. So if you know you need more, get it in by next week sometime so that, you can pick those up at your leisure rather than when you don't have time to do it. Calculators. Again, make sure that you're using the correct calculators. The calculators are out on the test delivery system. The only people that should be using calculators are those kids that aren't comfortable using the one on the computer, because it's already embedded in there, the correct calculator. You'll have less problems. It is important to only use the calculator for session 2 and 3 of grade 7 and 8 math and grade 2 of that EOC. If you use the calculators before on session 1, that's an automatic invalidation. You don't want that to happen. So if you are passing calculators to kids, make sure you do not do it before the time for session 2 and or 3. Okay, again, providing a calculator with prohibited functionality or for the wrong test session is reason for invalidation. Same holds true for reference sheets. I think 2 years ago, we had a school that at the last minute, the principal said, I want these kids to have reference sheet in hand rather than accessing it through the computer. So everybody was scrambling, including the test coordinator. A very, very helpful clerk came up and said, I've got the reference sheet right here. And she copied it, gave it out to every student. Well, instead of pulling it out of this year's manual, she had it from last year's manual. So basically, the state said, no, that was an unfair advantage because they had changed, and we had to invalidate an entire school geometry test. They had to retake it on paper later. So do not keep these around. That's another reason for not keeping old manuals around. It's also a reason for doing things ahead of time. Talk to your principal about the things that you've decided so that she or he does not come back and say, well, I think we really need to have this available for the kids. You don't want those decisions to be made last minute because that's where the errors come in. Okay? Just get those things done ahead of time. Okay, headphones, earbuds, Bear already talked about. Make sure that, you've got those set up. Please make sure that that you have them plugged in before you turn those computers on. That will make a difference as to whether they work. If you turn the computers on and then plug them in, chances are they will not work. It's very spotty. Also, don't forget to make that sound check. Those are very important to get that done before the test starts rather than after. The tools that kids use for CBT, make sure that they're practicing using those tools. Remember that your kids taking retakes, even though those are the kids that have probably already gone through those practice tests, remember those are also the kids that aren't doing very well. They didn't pass, so they're having to take it again. They need all the practice they can get. Make sure they have a chance to do that and go through and use the tools that are available for them. A lot of the things we're talking about right now are things that we're going to be discussing during the actual Tide and Pearson trainings that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. So we're going to kind of cruise through this pretty quickly. Computers, make sure the latest version of the Air Secure browser must be installed. So you need to talk to your TSR and make sure they've done their piece in installing that. And make sure it's on every computer. If you get a batch of new computers in between now and testing, which I know people probably have coming in, I'm seeing some head shaking, make sure you do the infrastructure trial and they're completely set up before testing. You can't use those computers until you have checked them out and done the infrastructure trial. Otherwise, it's a crapshoot as to whether they're going to work or not. You need to be sure. You don't want to find out by the kids crashing and burning on the test because they can't get in or it crashes, and then they get frustrated, and then parents call, and it's just a big hoo-ha that you don't want to have to go through. Test tickets, we'll be talking about how to create those test tickets if you don't know already. I would highly suggest that you download the Tide field guide, Tide user guide. Thank you. The Tide user guide before you get to the training next week or the week after. Whenever that Tide and that Pearson, there are user guides for both. There is an additional information in those user guides specific to how to use those platforms that is not in the test administration manual. The demographic information, the biggest piece I can say about this is use that FLEA ID number. That has to be used. You cannot use the 4800 number. You cannot use the Social Security number any longer. It must be that FLEA ID. We just got a list from the state. Did you download that, the FLEA ID list off SharePoint? How big is it? It's big, okay? We just got a list of kids with incorrect FLEA ID numbers or there's duplicates from the state. We'll be contacting you. Bear just said it's big, We're going to be going through that in the next couple of days, so we may be contacting you. We've got to do the verification, because remember, things have ramifications. If the FLE ID number is not connected to the right kid, guess what happens to the reports? They don't get reported. What happens? That kid's not going to count for your school grade. That kid's not going to count for the teacher's VAM. Big ramifications down the road. So please make sure that you're using that, you're double checking it. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a report on EduSoft or anything that has that in a downloadable?
The only place you've got it on in your transfer folder, although it's fairly old, we did that a couple of months ago. Huh? October. We did just a list of all the FLE ID numbers. They are trying to fix it so that there is a downloadable version. The problem is that it was kind of put in after the fact, and so getting it into a place where IT can download it, they are working on it, but I don't think it's live yet. We'll double check on that. But there is a version as of October, which is current as of then, and we'll see about maybe seeing if they can't get a newer version put into your transfer folders, and I'm seeing some head shaking, so we'll see if we can't get that new one out there in the next week or so, so that you have a newer version. I know this is a big pain in the butt, but it kind of came from the state. We thought this was going to be a transition year for moving to FLE ID, and we'd use both, but they just cut it off and said, nope, that's all you can use. So please try to make sure that you're using those, or make sure you're using those, and get them double checked, please. Again, the demographic information, we have already done the upload for FSA. It is out there. The only thing that you have to update are the accommodations. Our system does not hold the actual accommodations for the kids, so we can't put those in. You do need to add the ESC accommodations to those kids that have them onto Tide. Everything else is out there. If you are adding a new student to Tide, you do need to add all of the information. It will not take it with just partial. Okay, support during testing. Again, you can contact the help desk. If it's something very technical in nature, your TSR's double checked, don't know why these kids can't get in, contact the help desk. If it is something more general in nature about should this kid test, I've got a problem with this kid didn't finish, those kinds of things, call Bear and I. Sometimes we can help. If you're having trouble getting through to the help desk, or you've done it and it isn't resolving, give us a call and we will try to escalate it for you and monitor and make sure you get pushed to the top of the line so that you get your problem fixed, whatever it is. We want to make sure that we don't have kids just sitting there waiting for you to get a problem resolved. Okay, if a kid is having a problem getting on and they can't get on within 2 times, maybe 3, send them back to class until you get it resolved. We've had a lot of problems in the past where people were just letting the kids sit there for hours trying to get on. That's not good, because the kid gets frustrated, they get out of test mode in their head, and they don't want any part of it. So if they aren't getting on, get them out of there and send them back to class. It's better to take care of them during a makeup session than it is during just letting them get too frustrated during the actual test. Okay, these we're going to cruise through really quickly because I think we've touched on all of this, your responsibilities, but this document is out in the manual. It's also out on the website, the portal. Please go through, especially if this is your first time. If you check every box off of this and you've done all of these things, you will have gotten through testing fairly successfully without any big major problems. This will take you through all the steps you need to complete before testing. again, work with us. You're being trained now. You'll still go through some Tide and Pearson training. You've got your user guides and your manuals. Please sit down and read them. I know they're terribly boring, but once you get through, the more often you do it, the quicker it is that the easier they are to read. You can kind of pick up what the new things are. Again, we've uploaded all the kids into Tide. You can start working with it now. We just uploaded the EOC and the Algebra 1 retake. There is a slight problem with that, with the ELL designations, and we're working to fix that. So don't get too excited about working with those EOCs yet. We're working on that to fix it. We did send a file up. There are kids out there, but the ELL designations are not correct, and we're trying to get that fixed. Laura?
Students enrolled in OCBS, are they uploaded as ours, or are they uploaded as
Did you hear?
The kids that are uploaded, the kids that are,
dual enrolled in Orange County Virtual School, are they uploaded as ours or Orange County Virtual?
They should have been uploaded as yours. I reminded her that she needs to use School of Enrollment, not School of Instruction.
Because that has not been happening.
They,
It didn't happen in,
they're still at virtual school?
that didn't happen, I don't know about this one because I haven't checked, but that did not happen in the winter
Oh, I know it didn't happen the last time.
year.
But I've double checked with her, and I'll try to double check with her before I leave today and make sure that's been done. But I did remind her before she ran the file. Okay, again, in order to participate, they have to be in Tide. You cannot test them unless they're in Tide. Receiving the materials, again, you're going to start getting those, verify them, make sure you have enough now. Don't wait until the couple of days before testing, because chances are you may have to wait for your materials. We've already talked about all these materials. Managing student information in Tide will be going into much more depth on the Tide training. Adding students, assigning accommodations, all of those things. So if you're not comfortable out there on Tide yet, I would wait until after we give that training in order to do that. Printing tickets, the required administration information, we've already talked about that. That's what comes out of or goes into what used to be the district coordinator only box or DACO box. You do need to keep those things. They're all on page 237. The seating charts, the checklist, all of those things that you need to keep, the security logs. Seating charts, chain of custody forms, assigning the proctors. It's not too early to start working on this. Get those proctors assigned. Bear talked about that very early on in this. Make sure you get those guys assigned and ready to go. Accommodations. I'm just going to say that this is probably the biggest place for invalidations we have. We constantly get, when a parent calls me and said, my kid didn't get accommodations, and we call the school and the teacher says, I didn't know I had kids with accommodations. Your teacher should know what kids they have and which ones are getting accommodations at least a week before the test, if not more. You need to start working with your staffing specialist now, with your CCT now, to work on lists so that you can hand that teacher a list and say, here's a list of the kids you're testing during session 1. Here are the accommodations they get. They need to have that in writing. If you're not doing that, that's unacceptable. Because that's the biggest place we have invalidations of kids not getting the accommodations that they need. And again, making sure that they've had a chance to use those accommodations, especially if they're the computer-based accommodations. Meeting with your technology coordinator. Preparing the settings, making sure things are taken off the wall if they need to be. Making sure those devices are ready. Okay, again, during testing, You need to oversee the preparation of everything. And actually, during the testing, you need to be available to answer questions. You can give makeup tests, but you should never be involved in the actual testing during the big, regular days of testing. You need to be available to get folks where they need to be, take care of any issues, call me, be giving the district office a call, either Bear or myself, if there's any issues. You cannot be a test administrator during the regular testing days. Again, just making sure the proctors, everybody knows what to do. Electronic devices, breaks, they should already have that information based on the training you've given. What the policies and procedures are. Test security, again, you need to go through that with all of your teachers. And we will have a PowerPoint for you to use with your teachers by next week so that you don't have to create something from scratch. We'll have the PowerPoint available with all the stuff on there that you need to go over your teachers with. And that way you can tweak it with just the things that you need to that are just applicable to your school. Make sure you can be arranging the practice sessions now. All of the kids have to sit through practice sessions for tests that they've never sat through. So all of your 9th graders need to sit through a 9th grade ELA practice test before they get to the actual test. You must do that prior. Now, if you have kids that are retakers, they do not necessarily have to go through the practice test. It's not a bad idea, though. Who are your retakers? They're the kids that are struggling anyway. I would make sure you make available to them, even if you don't make them do it, make it available for them and make sure and encourage them to go through and do those practice tests. They need all the help they can get if they're not passing it. Distributing the test materials, supervising the administration and maintaining security. The testing rules acknowledgement, and again, even if a student who refuses to affirm the testing rules acknowledgement, they'll still be tested. It's not going to get them out of testing. That'd be too easy, okay? But you do need to keep a record of that. So if it ever comes back, you know that, well, that student, refused to sign the agreement. It's not going to get them out of testing. You do want to keep notes like that somewhere available, because when something like that comes back up, I guarantee you will not remember it. Monitoring student progress, we'll talk about the reports that you can pull off of Tide and Pearson that show you student progress. We're hoping they've fixed most of those. I think they have. That were kind of problematic last year. There are some reports you can do to keep up on how the students are progressing, and we've also how to supervise those makeup administrations. You've got to keep up on those makeups and which kids still need to take it. Receiving the materials from the test administrators. Again, this is very small except for 7 and 8 writing. You're not going to have a lot of materials, but you do need to take care of the materials and the paperwork for the hard copies you do get, the actual paper tests that you do get. And updating, do the invalidations. The thing about computer-based testing is 4 o'clock, the last day of the window, is when it shuts down. You need to take care of all the invalidations before that time, or it closes down and you cannot invalidate after that point. So do not hold off and think, oh, I'll do that a couple of weeks from now and just take care of the invalidations. Doesn't work that way. The system shuts down at 4 o'clock, the last day of the window. All invalidations, all kids being put into the system, whatever needs to happen out there needs to happen by 4 o'clock. They will not hold it open any later than that. And recording the accommodations. You do need to record that out there, and that needs to be one of the things that's done before that 4 o'clock. And preparing materials for return. We've already talked about those quite a bit. Making sure that you get those materials to going into the right place. Putting the materials in the wrong box could very well hold up the materials, or your reports rather, from that. So please take time, make sure you double check it, triple check it before you send that off to us. And the appendices. Every appendices in the back of the books are the same. You've got the accommodations. They're the same in every manual. Get to know those. Pull those out and give them to your staffing specialist and your CCT so that they understand those accommodations. The help desk number is out in Appendix B. C is the statute and rule, and D is always the perforated forms and signs. Make sure you go through that with your teachers and which ones they need to have. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn this over to Bear, and he's going to wrap it up with science and the NGSSS.
All right, let's rock and roll. Science, you'll start getting those manuals. They're going to be green. They should be arriving starting today on through the end of the week. 8th grade science is one day with 2 80-minute sessions. It's a little bit different than many of the other tests that you guys are administering, so make sure that you are adhering to that. Some things that are new is the death of the document count form. No longer will you have to worry about document count forms. You'll just do your counts, put stuff in the boxes, and ship them out. Also, of course, we've talked about the FLEID. There are no comment forms as well for the science tests. As you know, for many of you last year, you can now print the labels for science from Pearson Access Next. We will cover that in greater detail at next week's training for Pearson Access Next, so just be aware of that. Return labels are no longer yellow. You'll be receiving white labels for those of you at the middle schools for not to be scored materials. And then, of course, you want to make sure that if a student leaves campus due to them being sick or what have you like that, they cannot come back and continue testing. So if you know that the kid's going to be leaving campus for an appointment, or if you see that they are sick before they begin testing, you want to arrange for a makeup day. Same thing as we've been talking about, maintain the chain of custody form at all times. You want to make sure that your test administrators are not erasing stray marks. That is a big no-no. You want to make sure that the only corrections you make are to the demographics page. So like if a kid bubbled the not to be scored bubble, then you want to make sure that you make that correction. But as far as anything else, you want to leave it as is. Same thing as you mentioned before about FLVS, you want to make sure that you provide accommodations and testing for those kids. And then you want to make sure that when it's time to ship materials, what you don't want to do is you don't want to put your to be scored materials in a box labeled not to be scored. What happens is the vendor, which is DRC and Pearson, for these materials, if they're mislabeled, they basically get checked at the very last moment. So your test scores and so forth like that will not be processed till like late reporting, and that could be November or December. And then, of course, they won't be a part of your school grade, which means your principal will not be smiling with you in the morning. We'll talk more about Avocet at our Pearson training, but make sure that your test administrators know the specific amount of time for each administration. We talked about our ELL kids and our ESC kids that need to get the proper accommodations. Make sure that you have planned the school day according to the number of minutes needed for each session. Large print, Braille, etc. is available for these tests. We will order them accordingly. And then we talked about makeup sessions already and making sure that you follow the policies at all times. With makeup sessions for 8th grade, this is the only exception. I'll say this again. For 8th grade, this is the only test exception. They can do session 1 and session 2 on the same day for 8th grade because that's how their test is. But you can't do that for any of the other tests. Sample test materials are available via the state website, which is under the statewide science page, so you can access it here for your teachers. Calculators are only permitted for 8th grade science, and it's the 4-function calculator. They cannot use scientific calculators nor graphing calculators for 8th grade science. They'll also need to have periodic tables, so make sure that those are provided for them. And then, of course, you want to make sure that they are distributed to each student, and once they write their name on it, it becomes a secure material. Of course, kids can use the periodic table anytime they need to during the test. And then, of course, you won't send them in a DACA box because we don't take those. You will save them at your school and then shred them at the appropriate time. We've talked about student demographic information on the test booklets. You want to make sure that they are filled out correctly. But of course, because you have the ability to print on-demand labels, you're going to just print those and make your life way easier. If you find that the information on the pre-ID label is incorrect, then you'll need to make sure that you go in and correct that information in Pearson Access Next before printing the correct label. If you have a label, the only stuff that you'll need to grid is the accommodations information. But if you don't have a label, you'll have to grid everything else. If a book does not have a label and it's not gridded, it will not be scored. All right, because we'll have no way of knowing who to give that to, and it's a prolonged process to figuring out who that test booklet actually belongs to. So rule of thumb, use a pre-ID label. It will make your life easier. We talked about the fact that you can print the labels. We will let you know how to get the blank labels that are needed for these, and of course, the printing directions. Again, make sure you put the labels in the correct spot. This is even more so important for the science because for some reason, I guess by the time science rolls around, you guys get tired and then you don't pay attention. So a lot of times with science, we have where schools are putting the labels over the barcodes for entire classes, entire schools, that kind of thing, and then it does not become fun. So just make sure that you are paying special attention to where those labels need to be. As we mentioned before, kids can't help you put labels on. And then, of course, you want to make sure that any labels that are not going to be used are shredded. All right, we already talked about place labels here. The same student to proctor and test administrator ratios still apply for the NGSS test. It's identical to FSA testing, as you can see here. Missing materials, because there are so many paper-based materials for science, make sure that you're keeping accurate counts of the materials that you have. That way things don't go missing. If a test administrator checks out 18 books from you, you're supposed to get 18 test booklets back from him or her. Keep in mind that when materials go missing, you are the person that's responsible. We're going to be asking you about those materials, so you can't blame it on anyone else. So the minute you find out that something is missing, you need to call in the FBI and find that missing test booklet. All right. Make sure that because this happens a lot, the periodic tables are not left in the test booklet when you're preparing them for shipping. Make sure those are pulled out and not sent to the vendor. We talked about making sure that the proper test documents are labeled correctly and placed in the correct box. If you are at a K-8 school, make sure you separate grades 5 from grades 8 so that they can be scored accordingly. The labels for to be scored will be red, and then the white labels will be for not to be scored materials. For Braille and large print, those labels will be blue for large print and pink for Braille. Just make sure that when you receive your materials that you put those to the side so that they can be applied to the box for return. All right. The appendices are the same as we've mentioned before. And then, now let's talk about the NGSS tests. All right, we're almost done. All right, so NGSS and of course tests are biology, civics, U.S. history, and then of course we have the FCAT retakes that is about to go away. This is actually going to be the last administration of the FCAT reading retake. I know if you graduated when I did, well, actually, no, I think that was HSCT, never mind. But yeah, FCAT reading retake, this is the last administration of that. Next year, everybody will take the ELA, the FSA ELA retake. The manual is blue, which is my favorite color. By now, you guys should all have the correct browser downloaded at your school and on the computers because you did your infrastructure trial. Again, no document count forms are needed for paper-based materials. And then, of course, remember that if you have issues with Pearson-based tests, do not call AIR because they're going to tell you to call Pearson. All right? So make sure you're calling the right number. For the Pearson Access Next accommodations, we have text-to-speech, masking, and the reading passage booklets, which are available for the reading retake only. And then, of course, you want to make sure that proctor caching is done prior to testing. All right? Sometimes schools like to skip that, and then when they run into technical issues, the first question that's going to come up is were the tests proctor cached, which basically means that they're saved on the server and can be retrieved. If they can't be retrieved, that's another nightmare that you don't want to have to wake up to. Marked complete. Tell your test administrators, never, ever mark a student completed. The only person at the school site that should ever mark a kid complete is you. And normally that's because the kid did not submit their test for some reason. Either they just simply forgot to because the test administrator wasn't paying attention, or they got sick, or you're invalidating the test. That is the only time you mark a test complete. So again, tell your test administrators, do not mark kids complete. It does take quite a bit of a process if it's been marked complete and shouldn't be. Cindy and I are the only ones that can take care of that, and they don't like doing that. So make sure you're the only one marking tests complete. The EPAT test, make sure you're doing these practice tests with your kids as well. Most cases, the EPATs are available via the TestNav, but you can also download them onto the computers for your students. All right, now, FCAT reading retake takes about half of the school day. This is the last time where kids will have the option of taking both sessions on the same day. And of course, they'll need a sealed code. If you're familiar with that process, you know that you must have in writing that they're aware that the test is to be given over 2 days. However, they are electing to take it over 1 day. The EOCs are 160 minutes, but kids can continue testing until they're done, as long as they're done before the end of the school day. That is whether or not they have ESC accommodations, ELL accommodations, or not. All right? Kids can start leaving after the first 80 minutes of testing, but you're not to encourage them to finish early. You're not giving out gift cards because they got done in 90 minutes. All right? Student authorization tickets are mildly different from those of TIDE. The authorization tickets include both the username and the password. That's what they look like. We've talked about the test group code that you're going to be creating that 4-digit number, which is going to be unique. So make sure that you are keeping track of the test group codes that you are using. All right. The other thing too is for the test group codes, make sure that you're documenting them. A lot of times when we look at scanned documents, we'll see that your security logs don't have the test group code, your seating charts don't have the test group code, and of course, you know that you can use the same test group code for session 1 and session 2, but if you're using a test group code for biology, it should be different for U.S. history. Seal code is only for the reading retake, and we'll talk about using the seal code at the Pearson training. It's to unlock the test from session 1 to session 2, and those are secure. Do not print the seal code on day 1 for session 1 if you don't have kids that are going to be testing session 1 and session 2 on the same day. And this is what the printout for the seal codes looks like. Work folders are available for biology, so make sure that the kids have what they are needing for that particular test, as well as for the periodic table. Once kids use the work folder, make sure that you collect them. They do need to have their names on them. And then once they've been used, they become secure materials. CBT worksheets are for civics, U.S. history, and the reading retake. Kids can make notes on them, but of course, once they use them, they also become secure materials. If a kid needs an additional sheet, you're able to provide them with that, but make sure your test administrators are keeping track that if they give a kid 2, that they are collecting 2. Calculators, 4-function calculators only for the biology test. You don't need a calculator for civics, nor U.S. history, or for reading for that matter. However, TestNav does have the built-in calculators, so if you don't have the handheld calculators, just have them use the one on the computer. It makes life so much easier. All right? And then, of course, if you have kids with visual impairments, they can use the large print or large key calculators or talking calculators as needed. If you don't have calculators at your site, we are not providing them. We're talking about the 4-function calculators. You can either order them, which your school will have to pay for, or use the one on the computer. Talked about the periodic table. You can make copies as needed, but there's also a window on TestNav where they can access the periodic table. And then, of course, you can also print copies from Appendix D in the back of the manual. You're not required to give hard copies, but you can choose to do so. But if you do give a hard copy, once the kid writes their name, it's secure. All right? Make sure that if you're making copies that they look identical to the original and that there's nothing missing. CBT tools, these are the computer-based tools on the test. When kids are doing the practice tests, they'll be familiar with these tools. Demographic information, of course, you're going to be taking care of that in Pearson Access Next, so just make sure that it's been accurately verified. We talked about pre-ID labels for paper-based accommodations. Make sure that you are applying the labels to the booklets, especially those of you at the high schools. You have the ability to print labels. You are familiar with printing labels. Continue to do so. Do not return books without the labels affixed to them. This bubble does need to be filled in for kids who are taking the EOCs. This talks about their prior enrollment, whether or not they're currently in the class or previously took the class. It's the same thing that's in TIDE when you're creating a new student. It's just in the form on the paper-based test. Security breaches, Cindy has talked about this several times. If you encounter this, make sure that you contact us right away so that we can get the process rolling and that you are conducting thorough investigations so that A, we can prevent these and also make sure that we have all the information and can take the proper actions thereafter. All right? If you have reading passage booklets, maintain the security of that. Those are secure booklets, so make sure you're aware of their whereabouts. You do have the administrative checklist. I know a lot of times at the high schools and even at the middle schools, you don't like to have to do administrative checklists because it's just 1 or 2 test booklets. It seems a little ridiculous, but it is required, so make sure that you are following those procedures. All right, we talked about the security numbers and how to maintain them, and of course, not covering up the barcodes on the test booklets. And then, of course, one last thing, you want to make sure that the security numbers that you receive match your shipping list. All right, make sure that it is accurate and that when you're done with testing, that you hold on to those at your school site so that you can upload them to the TDM site. And I can't believe we did it, but that's all, folks. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
For the scholar designation on, the letter, don't you send a letter? It's my first time in high school, so is there something you would send to those students who aren't necessarily US or bio, maybe they're EP or ACE or whatever?
Okay.
They have to fill out a letter to be able to qualify to take it?
There is a letter that you would provide for them to take home. That letter is located on the NGSS IMS page, and it says Scholar Diploma Letter.
I have another question.
Sure.
too. Please don't kill me for asking.
Nope, not at all.
I'm thinking in regards to scheduling.
Yes.
Disruptive. For SAT and FSA, can they be done on the same day? Or, because you know, one's on the 6th and one's on the 7th?
I know. Yeah, that's because that's how it was done on the calendar. So the FSA writing has to be done on the 6th. It's being done on that day for grades 4 through 10 and retakes earlier. And then, of course, SAT school day is the next day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Figured I'd ask.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt. All right. If you have individual questions, feel free to come on up and ask us. Make sure that you're writing the component number on your sheets, as well as that you're writing down 3 points for today's training. All right? Thank you all for coming. Have a great afternoon.
Individual questions. I don't want to hold up everybody. You mentioned that they take.